Morning everyone.
Morning.
I'm speaking this morning on generosity, but as has been alluded to there, I've decided that in speaking on generosity, the natural place to begin is, of course, the Battle of the Ducks. I'm sure that's what you were thinking as well. So here are the ducks. These are not the exact ducks. We'll find out on the exact ducks in a moment's time. But this morning is about our heart for generosity, looking specifically at service and at giving. So there is a reminder of the 4 weeks that we've done on this little series, walking out our values together. As we talk about values, ways of expressing church together, I'm so conscious that we are one of a kaleidoscope of different ways that church is expressed all around the world, all throughout history. And particularly in the area of giving, there's been a very broad range of different ways in which people have been encouraged and sometimes required to give. And sometimes that's been really life-giving, sometimes less so, and perhaps been a bit contentious. And so that's how we come on to our friends, the Ducks. So the story I'm going to read to you is set in the 1930s, and it centres on historical British expression of giving tithes. So you're going to need a bit of historical context for this. Okay, so what we're thinking here is, so you know the tithe barn here in Lennon? This is the kind of gist. Tithes were traditional payments that entitled the church to a tenth of the people's annual income. Usually the payments were made in kind, an agrarian society throughout sort of the Middle Ages and beyond. So this comes in the form of crops, wool, milk, other produce to represent a tenth of yearly production. Comes into places like the tithe barn. After the Reformation, much of the land from the church passed to lay owners who inherited the entitlement to receive tithes. This payment was demanded whether or not that particular parishioner even attended the church, and there were clearly then obviously a big bone of contention. So, yes, in the 1930s, you have the Ecclesiastical Commission, and their policy was, someone who's not giving their tithes, then goods were to be confiscated, and they effectively sent in the bailiffs to seize goods in lieu of unpaid tithe. This was clearly also very unpopular. So people came up with all sorts of creative ways of disrupting this process. In this part of the country, it became known as the Kentish Tithe Wars. I love that, that's quite a dramatic name. And unquestionably, the best part of this was the Battle of the Ducks. So back to the story. The campaign began when between 70 and 100 people, mostly young men, I'm not surprised by that, passionate young men, with some trucks, met at the halfway house on Dover Road. This was not far from Shepherdswell, down towards the coast, where the ducks had been taken on the orders of the ecclesiastical commissioners. So the ducks and other livestock had been seized because the farmer at Westwell, we might know Westwell, just past Charing, the Reverend Roderick Kedwood, had refused, as a matter of principle, to pay the tithes demanded of him. Kedwood was a Methodist minister from a Westwell farming family. Effectively, these young men, they go, and in the middle of the night, they take back Reverend Kedwood's ducks. And this nighttime raid in September 1934 was reported the following day in the national press, making the church authorities even more furious. So they sent their agents to retake the ducks again, and also persuaded the local police force to provide a substantial guard at the farm to which the ducks were taken for the whole of the following week. As far as we know, Reverend Kedwood never saw his ducks again. So if mandating of giving and confiscating the ducks of people that dare not to is perhaps not the gold standard, this morning I want to look together at what is. So we come to the context of generosity, in which we're going to talk about serving, talk about giving. This is my hope. If in half an hour's time you are feeling burdened by what you perceive to be a weight of expectation from me, then I feel I've failed to communicate heart in the way that I'm hoping to. Equally, if in half an hour's time you feel chilled and relaxed, ready to never think about this again, then I probably will have failed in the way that I'm hoping to communicate heart in this. So what I'm hoping is that you will feel free and you will feel to consider further what God is saying to you in this particular area. That's my hope. So we'll start with service, and I'm going to touch on that much more briefly. And the reason is because we've talked about it quite a lot in recent times, particularly for those that were part of the service practice that we did in our life groups. I thought it was amazing. The heart that they unpacked in that service practice, I would just really echo. The way they explored what it means to serve others, and the different ways they talked about expressing that. A couple of weeks ago, Ellen talked about generosity. She talked about discipleship. She talked about discipleship, and in that context, she talked about growing. And she used that as a metaphor within discipleship, and then in all things, we're called to keep growing. So I want to use this morning, as we talk about serving, just for a couple of minutes, just to seek to give you an exhortation to keep growing in the way that we generously serve others. We follow Jesus. This is the Jesus who, right at the end of his life, knelt down on the floor and washed the feet of his disciples. This is the Jesus that in that moment said, "This is an example I'm giving to you, for you to do to others." It's the same Jesus that said, "I didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many." It's the same Jesus who said that the greatest among you is the least. You can't look at the life and teachings of Jesus and not conclude that serving others is a central part of what it means to follow Jesus. For us at Pathway, since we've moved to meeting on a weekly basis, our encouragement was church home, that you would be on a rota once a month or more, where you can help contribute towards our gatherings on these Sunday mornings. And I'm really grateful for how well that's been received and how people have just mucked in and made it happen. That we've been able to double up the amount of times we meet on a Sunday morning, and it hasn't been a particularly stressful or strenuous thing. And that's down to the servant heart of so many. This morning, I want to, within that, call you higher in the way that the service practice that we explored was talking about, that we would continue to pursue a posture of heart that leads to a lifestyle of service. Because the reality is that the way we serve one another on rotas is really good and really important, but if we're honest, sometimes that can be the easier part. And actually, sometimes in daily life, with those around us, whether that be in your family or in your workplace or in friendship circles, being alert to the needs of others, being interruptible by the needs of others, that can be a higher thing that we are called to. And often, like I say, that starts closer to home and it grows as it becomes increasingly the way that we choose to live. So as we continue to grow in service and live beyond ourselves as a church, my real encouragement to you in this area is continue to come before God and foster within your own life, starting in that hidden place with Him, and then being outworked practically within the relationships that you are part of, where we are being the gift. We are being the gift that God is wanting to give to those people because of our presence and because of how ready we are to be there for them. Let us continue to be a people who express generous service. This church is strong there. Well done. Let us continue to be a generous people of service. So, I want to spend the rest of our time talking about giving. And for a long time, I have occasionally touched on the idea of financial giving. I've sort of mentioned it in passing, sort of briefly gone there. Never sort of fully unpacked things, and I've increasingly felt like it's pastoral negligence to not properly talk about giving in the context of our finances. And I feel that I'm sorry for that. And the reason I say that is because we're seeking to follow Jesus, and Jesus talked about money a lot. 11 of his 39 parables were about our money and our possessions and what we do with them. And yet for me, I've been nervous to talk about it, and I'm just going to play the British card right now and say one of the big reasons for that is because I'm British, and we don't like to talk about money. And so I think that's played into it, why for me it's not been something I've sort of majored on in my preaching. But I also recognise that as soon as we start talking about money, it is a contentious thing. Because the way of Jesus in this particular area is absolutely at odds with the world, the flesh, and the devil. They say, accumulate, gather as much as you can. It is yours to do with in whatever way that makes you feel happy. Look after number one. Those are the messages that we receive in different ways. God says, in contrast, freely you've received, freely give. So previously I sort of felt a bit nervous, how do I talk about finances and giving and all the rest of it? But this morning I actually feel really excited about it. And that's nice. I'm grateful for what God's done in my own heart in that process. I really believe that one of the biggest reasons I feel excited to unpack some scriptures together this morning is because I deeply care about you. And I increasingly believe that this statement is true. That according to Jesus, your money and your possessions might be the greatest threat or the biggest opportunity to kingdom fruit in your life. So it's clearly quite an important thing to talk about. And if we don't, just like we talked about that metaphor of growing, if we don't, it can easily be one of the areas in our lives that we don't grow in because we're just not talking about it. The reality is that money deeply affects every single one of us. And I think we can sometimes become a bit numb to sort of the daily decisions we make because they can become quite repetitive and we can become used to where we're at with money and what we do and don't do with it. But we can shape that up very simply by a very basic thought exercise. Ready for this? Imagine tomorrow morning you go into work, you get called into your boss's office, you find out that your salary has doubled. There's some decisions to make. If you're taking home twice as much as you're taking home right now, all of a sudden you've got some really serious decisions to make in life. Imagine the other situation, you walk into the boss's office tomorrow morning, you find out that your salary's halved. There's some decisions to make. And in those kind of situations, they don't have to really think about things. The reality is we have to really think about things regardless. We have to think about things today. With whatever we've got, wherever we're at, we are always making decisions. Think about your last bank statement that came through. There is a list of decisions you made. Those are the decisions that you made for places that you did want your money to go to. For each one of the things on that list, there will be as many, potentially more, depending on how you are wired as a person, that didn't make the list, but you chose to say no to for whatever reason. I would suggest, I'm sure you'd agree, that every single one of us, on a daily basis, is making multiple decisions about what we do with our money and our goods. So it clearly needs to be a conscious part of our discipleship to Jesus. So I'm going to give you some principles this morning that I hope you're going to find really helpful. Principles that underpin this value we have for generosity in giving, and principles I'm hoping will help you practically to discern how to walk that out in your own life. So, in a moment we will look through some scriptures. Before we turn to the Bible, it's just recognizing again, like I say, money and finance affects all of us. But every single person in this room, this is why it's not an easy thing to talk about, every single one of you right now has a history of experiences, things that you have practiced or been taught or seen play out in your own life that will inform and shape the way that you view money and giving, and what you feel comfortable with and happy with, and what might make you a bit uncomfortable, what might make you cross. There are all sorts of reactions that can be provoked from this. And it's just recognizing that, yeah, okay, that's where we're at. Because each of us have led different lives up until this point, we have formed pictures. For Kat and I, throughout our marriage, we have practiced financial giving, sought to give generously. For a lot of the time, that was a faithful giving 10%. That's kind of what it looks like, and I'm going to come back to that in a bit. But a while ago, the prospect that I would stand up and speak to other people about this made me think, okay, well, have I really grappled for myself with what the Bible was saying about this? Have I really found peace with what I believe Jesus is asking of me? And so I did that. I had a process of really exploring this, and what I'm going to share with you this morning, I hope will be helpful. And it's sort of my summary of things. I will recognise that, yeah, like I say, it is one of those issues that people will have different perspectives on. I'm going to share my own convictions based on the research that I've done, and we'll take it from there. So, quick summary. I'm going to reduce lots and lots of notes I made into literally a few minutes, because I want to also make sure we get in practical with it as well. So, Old Covenant under Moses, the practice of tithing is very clearly commanded. But it's more than just a simple give a 10% tithe. The scholarly consensus is there are actually at least 3 tithes in play that equate to at least 23% of someone's income. Those tithes were used for very different things. So for some of that tithe that is going towards caring for the poor, for some it is providing for the Levites who are serving people. For others, it is literally set aside for big parties and celebrations, so people can enjoy the goodness and the abundance of God's provision. So there's a picture of tithes being given at that time. There's an additional note to it that I find really interesting, and that is, of course, that some of that was quite literally burned. That some of that was sacrificial in more ways than one. People were bringing something sacrificially, and that thing was being sacrificed. And part of that animal, whatever it was, is literally burned. That doesn't necessarily benefit Paul or the Levites or contribute towards a party, but there is in that an element of sacrifice and worship to God, and saying, I'm recognizing you as the provider of all things. And I choose to take my hands off of it, say everything I have comes from you. I think that's really interesting in there as well. So you see this system in the playing out through the Old Testament. We come to the New Testament, and I found it interesting to see there weren't examples of tithing within the early church. There weren't any commands to tithe in the early church. Long story short, I'm going to unpack this a bit further. My conviction is that the New Testament believer is not obligated to give a 10% tithe. I believe you are free to give when, what, how, to who, what you choose to give. But, here comes the but. Some of you might be feeling really excited by now. Some of you are feeling a bit nervous by now. Where are you going with this? Jesus really clearly says, I came to fulfill the law, not just abolish it. So what does that mean in this? When we look at the Sermon on the Mount, never once does Jesus take the law and lower the standards. Every single time, he raises the bar. Law says, don't murder. I'm saying to you, don't get angry with your brother. Law says, don't commit adultery. I'm saying to you, don't even look lustfully. I think it would be very difficult to assume that giving and generosity is the one area in which Jesus' heart would be for us to lower the standards. And so my conviction is that for the New Testament believer, we are called to a higher standard than the tithe. So what does that mean? Does that mean, we need to give 15%? No, let's go back to those examples in the Sermon on the Mount. So in those examples, what you've got is Jesus taking something that's very black and white, don't kill people, and bringing it into the much more murky waters of our hearts and our motives. Why does he do that? That's the next one. Can you read that okay? Jeremiah 31, verse 33, God says he's going to write his law on our hearts. That's quite important. Proverbs talks about guard your heart. Everything you do flows from your heart. I think the heart's quite important. And Jesus wants to raise the bar on what is happening within our hearts. Taking it out of the black and white and saying what is of first importance here is what's going on in your heart. Where is your heart at? Because everything you do is going to flow out of that. Throughout the Bible, God seems to really care about our heart, and he seems to get across numerous points throughout the Bible about hardness of heart. And that's something that can be expressed on both ends of the extreme within this topic. We can give consistently with a hard heart. We can say, this is the standard, this is what I'm going to give. God, that's your bit. And now I've ticked the box, got that out of the way, that's done for another month, and we can have a hard heart towards it. And then on the other end of the extreme, just as easily, we can say, I'm free to do whatever I want, and we keep it all. Don't want to give anything away. And we harden our hearts. The clear theme of Scripture of being a people of generosity, a people of open hands and tender hearts. God wants our hearts. We are called up from a black and white command to tithing into an invitation of generosity. Now, if you're thinking, okay, well, this is making it quite vague, what do we do now? Well, the good news is, the next slide, Paul is going to flesh this out. I want to use some of these principles together as we talk about it further. So, two different passages from his letter to the Corinthians give us some principles for a standard of generous living. Pastorally, I want to echo this. This is pretty safe ground. Just to say, yeah, I agree with Apostle Paul. So that's what I'm going to do. And these principles are, in my heart, would underpin our value for generosity. So I'm going to go through them quick. So you're welcome to make a note of them and come back to them later if you'd like to meditate on it further. So 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 are a brilliant passage to read. The reason is because Paul is encouraging the believers in Corinth to give. So that's quite helpful, because that's the exact sort of thing we're talking about here. In chapter 8, verse 8, he explicitly says to them, I am not commanding you to give. But he appeals to them in a whole multiple different list of ways. So let's have a look. He highlights at the beginning the example of the sacrificial Macedonians. And he says to the church in Corinth, listen, they haven't got much. They're poor, but they sacrificially gave for the sake of others. He highlights the example of Jesus and the famous words, he who was rich became poor. He says Jesus gave up what he had for our sake. He, in chapter 9, verse 6, gives the principle the Bible gives in multiple other places. You reap what you sow. He reminds them of that. He reminds them very practically that if you give, you are providing for their needs. These people that are in need, your giving will provide for that. He says that God will be glorified as you give. And then finally, this little bonus, those people, they'll love you and they'll pray for you if you give and provide for their needs. So he appeals to them and exhorts them, give generously because of these reasons. In his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, chapter 16, verse 2, he doesn't talk about a set amount. He doesn't say, this is what is expected of you, but he gives a couple of really helpful things. He mentions here giving regularly, and he talks about in keeping with your own income. And that I found interesting, that idea of, he doesn't go as far as saying, this is the percentage, but he does say, I'm asking you to give in keeping with your own income. There's that sort of proportionate idea going on as well. I think that in these verses he finds such a beautiful balance, which I want to echo for us, and that is that he communicates grace and freedom, but his aim wasn't just to put them at ease. Oh, we're under grace, not the law. Relax. Don't worry about it. But it's to show them that we are called to be a people of generosity, a people who give. Giving inevitably costs us something. And he's saying to the Corinthians, like the Macedonians, be a people who are prepared to sacrificially give, because these reasons matter. This little list, these are incredible reasons. Inevitably for the Corinthians and the Macedonians, there would have been things that they therefore said no to, didn't show up on their bank statement next month because of what they had chosen to give. But their decision, and Paul's encouragement to them, is these reasons are worth it. So, what I want to do is go from sharing and encouraging you with these principles to just sharing openly about my own life. So I'll brace myself for the vulnerability hangover. Have you heard that expression before? A vulnerability hangover. That's what I'll have in about 10 minutes' time. Because I thought, I wanted to be able to give biblical principles as I see it expressed. But I also wanted to be honest and transparent about this is how I express things in my own life. I'm not saying you therefore have to do the same as what I do, but I just thought there's no reason not to share. So, God's done some amazing things for me throughout my life and for Kat and I during the part of life that has been together. And we have sought to live generously and express this value in our life and have seen them just come through again and again. So during my sort of young adult years, I was taught a principle of a 10% tithe, give 10% of your money to the church. And that's what I lived by for many years. And there are many reasons why I actually found it quite helpful. And I definitely experienced what Paul's reminding the Corinthians of in terms of you reap what you sow. And I saw God do amazing things within our own personal finances at that time. When I went through this phase a little while ago of doing all this research myself and wanting to feel that sense of, I feel a sense of conviction because I've really researched myself, I've read the different passages, I looked at a whole bunch of different scholars and pastors and what are they saying about it and coming to peace with what do I believe on this. When I went through that process, I no longer felt like that 10% was a set standard, it's like the thing that had to be done. And so I had this season of feeling, I'm sort of free from that 10%. But we at that time felt like actually these principles of regular and proportionate, that is what we wanted to continue to do. So we continued to, our resolve was that's what we wanted to do, and we wanted to continue to give 10%. I want to share a little story. So this is a couple of years ago, our budget wobbled, and I started to feel a bit nervous. And so I got the jitters at this time. It's a bit of honesty for you. In hindsight, my first response wasn't to turn to my provider and say, hey, look, there's some shaking going on here. You are my provider. I trust in you. My response was, okay, well, I'll have a think about this. We just need to get through this. And my heart, I don't know if I would have articulated it in this way, but my heart was effectively saying, I need to make sure that we are okay. And I need this money. So for a while, I reduced what we gave because my heart said, I need this. I'm going to make sure my family's all right. I'm going to use that money for something else. So we reduced what we were giving. And after a while, I started to feel quite uneasy. It definitely hadn't been something I had prayed through and consulted with the Lord. It'd just been a sort of decision that I had made basically out of fear. And I knew that the principles that we wanted to live out in our life of generosity, principles that I'd previously held to firmly, were principles I wasn't living out at that time. So we came to a point where we had a second car, a little run around, and it was coming up towards MOT time, and it was going to fail, and it was going to fail spectacularly, and there was no way I could justify the repairs that were going to be needed to get this thing through its MOT. It had 130-something thousand miles on the clock, and I thought this thing has seen its final MOT. Took it to WeBuyAnyCar.com to get their base rate or whatever it was. But at that point, like I say, I've been feeling uneasy, and I resolved in my heart, okay, I'm going to get this money from WeBuyAnyCar.com. I want to return to what I had felt before God was the standard generosity that I wanted to be giving to. We buy any car, have the conversation, make the transfer, comes into my bank account, give them the keys, thank you very much, walk out of their little office, got my phone out of my pocket, opened up my banking app, and I transferred there and then the amount of money that I hadn't given based on where I wanted to be in terms of giving. So I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling like before God, I feel like that's what He was asking of me, and I've done that. I think, I wish I'd sort of written it down to remember, I think it was literally like 2 days later, sitting at home in the lounge and hear the letterbox flat. There's a card there on the mat. It's Christmas time. Open up the card, Christmas card, lovely. Someone's hand delivered a Christmas card. It's an anonymous Christmas card. And I can see why someone's chosen to do that anonymously, because it's a Christmas card full of money. Oh my goodness, wow, this is cool. Start to flick through the multiple notes in this card, and as I did, I just started to cry. Because even before I got to the end, I knew exactly what was coming. And I knew what I was about to discover, which was correct, that the amount of money in that card was the exact, to the penny, amount that I had transferred when I walked out of WeBuyAnyCar.com. It was amazing. And it was a really formative moment in my life. And I knew it was God saying, I see your heart. I see that your heart had withheld out of fear because you looked at the budget and felt nervous and thought, I'm going to hold back because I'm going to make sure that we get through this. But God's saying, I saw that your heart towards me is to live generously, sacrificially, even when it didn't always make sense, but to have open hands towards Him. You are my provider. It's a really powerful lesson. So yeah, for Kat and I, the way we've chosen to express these different principles that I've gone through this morning is that our giving does start with, we give a tenth of our gross income. We choose to give that straight to the church. That's what we do. And then beyond that, I want to grow my muscles of generosity. So we look for opportunities to individuals or causes or whatever it is where we can give further, because it's something I want to grow in, and it's also something that I know my heart needs. Do I do that because I feel obligated to? Definitely no. I don't feel like that's what I have to do, and I'm not communicating to you that you have to do. I don't feel obligated in it, but I would do it because I want to live generously, because I want to live sacrificially, because that is how Jesus has lived towards me. And I believe in this awesome list that Paul has shared with the church in Corinth. I also believe in the famous words of John Calvin, where he says, the human heart is a perpetual factory of idols. How about that one? The human heart is a perpetual factory of idols. And I read that and I go, yep, that sounds a bit like me. And I know, my heart will occasionally daydream. What else I could be doing with that money? And I know there is that wrestle with the flesh. When I declare God is my provider, that's a powerful thing to say. When I make that declaration each month as I transfer that money, there's a weightiness in that moment to say, God is my provider. I'm letting go of control. Everything I have comes from Him. So, as we start to wrap this up, if we just think about the church as a whole for the moment, I just want to say that these principles that I've shared for us individually as we grow as generous people with a generous Saviour, these are the same principles for how we handle money as a church. We take financial stewardship as a church seriously. We want to be generous towards different people and different needs, locally, internationally. We set aside money and we give in a number of different ways towards that. We have an annual budget because we believe in good stewardship. We have trustees who safeguard the financial stewardship of the church. Our giving and use of money is very transparent. I want to tell you, you can ask whatever question you want anytime. It's absolutely fine. There are no secrets within the Pathways church budget and use of finances. I think at some point in the future it'd be great to have a meeting where anyone who wants to can come along, where we'll sort of share our annual budget and what we do and how we do it. And if you are interested in that and would like to ask questions, you'd be very welcome to come, or you can chat to me before. That's absolutely fine. So, in wanting to walk out this value of generosity, I'm really hoping this has come across as a pastoral exhortation. Like I say, not a sort of burdensome, do this, that, or the other, but an exhortation like Paul is giving to the church in Corinth. Let's be a generous people for these reasons. In case it hasn't been totally clear, this is not a money grab. I'm not trying to coerce you into giving, but I believe that God passionately cares about our hearts. And I really believe, and my first-hand experience says, that generosity will transform our hearts in amazing ways. So, practically, in seeking to grow in generosity, I think it's the same as wanting to grow in anything else. And the principle is simple: start where you're at, start today. Don't put it off as something I'll think about on a rainy day. Don't think, oh, well, I can't do anything because I feel like I should do this, but I can't do that. Start with where you're at. Really interesting research about this. All kinds of interesting percentages, and research says the more money we get, the less philanthropic we become. I thought that was fascinating. So I just encourage all of us, if we wait until we have whatever we would deem enough in order to be more generous, the research would suggest we could be waiting a long time. And I think the reason behind that is relatively simple. I think money can be incredibly deceptive. And most of us tend to never think we have enough. So you might be, like I say, there are however many people, that's how many stories there are in the room this morning. You may have never given to a local church. You may have given to a local church for decades. You might be on autopilot at a certain level of giving, and God wants our hearts. And we come to Him in honesty to say, am I on either end of the extremes? I'll give God His bit, because He should get His bit, but then I'm done, box is ticked. Or, oh no, that all sounds a little bit, no, it's my money. I want to be able to do what I want to do with my money. And on either end of the extreme, our hearts can be hard towards Him. I would just encourage all of us to come before Him and say, Lord, do a work in my heart. Let me be soft towards you. Jesus is the one who gave it all for us. And our Father in heaven is the giver of everything that we need. We can always come back to that. We follow a risen Jesus who gave everything. And we serve a loving Father who says, I will provide the ends. So, giving and service. I believe the Father wants to graciously lead us forward, that in same as all the other areas we talked about in the last few weeks, we would be a people who are growing in what it means to follow Jesus, and expressing that in a greater measure as the weeks and months go by. That's that. If there are any parts of that that didn't come across clearly or well, please come and chat with me. I'd love to discuss it further. But yeah, I hope my heart did come across. I hope my vulnerability hangover isn't too intense as well. But let me pray. Oh, you're a good Father, and we recognize you as the provider of everything we need. You are the giver of good gifts. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you that he gave everything for us. And Lord, we thank you for the privilege that we get to give and support others. We get to grow as a people of generosity. We thank you that you want to use your church to provide in amazing ways for the needs of the world. And so, yeah, Father, as in all things, we want to bring our hearts before you this morning and just surrender again to you. Would you speak to us? Would you lead us forward? Would you make us more like you? Amen.